79. This is an interview with the Reverend Dayton Castleman, pastor of the Chinese Presbyterian Church in New Orleans. We are talking basically about the history of the Chinese Presbyterian Church. Mr. Castleman is the only pastor the church has had up to this point, and will be, I hope, for many years to come. Anyhow, regardless of that, this is where we are and what we are doing. Now, Dayton, suppose you start out and tell us, well, give us a little bit about yourself. You were born, I think, in Texarkana?
Oh, no.
No.
Louisville, Kentucky.
Louisville, Kentucky. I knew I was wrong.
In the year 1911.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And I was in Texarkana 13 years prior to coming to here.
Oh, that's right.
And so up to this point, come September the 1st, I will have been here 27 years.
That's a respectable time.
Yeah. And by the way, I had 2 years when I was pastor of the church at Higginsville, Missouri,
Yeah, I remember
back in your old territory.
That's right. You went to 1 year at the Dallas Seminary. You took your degree at the Louisville Presbyterian Seminary. You were ordained in Lafayette Presbytery, and
Right.
and went to Higginsville, and you were there, what, 2 years?
Yes, then I took some graduate work at Princeton prior to going to Texarkana.
And then somewhere along the line, while you were at Texarkana, I guess you had a year of language study, I believe.
Yes, I had 4 months only, right after World War II, anticipating the possibility of going to China. In fact, I was accepted to go just before Pearl Harbor. And then when that event of World War II occurred, that withdrew me from that as a possibility. And so then after the war, then the political situation was such, and the international conditions were such that it didn't work out for me to go to China. So then I came back to the pastorate, and they suggested that it'd probably be a little bit far removed getting out to China. And then when it came to Taiwan, there was very limited amount of workers. There were limited amount of workers that we were sending into Taiwan.
Now let's back up just a little bit. You married Lucy Fletcher from Augusta, Arkansas.
Right. Yeah.
I have been in Augusta.
Yes, I think one time you visited her when she was ill at the time of her terminal illness.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was...
We were very grateful for that, too.
Well, that was... when were you married?
I was married in 1942. And I married Lucy Fletcher, or Lucy Alina Fletcher.
Yes.
Of Augusta.
You have 2 children. One is pastor in New Orleans, and the other, Lucy, is married. And where does she live?
They've just moved to Selmer, Tennessee.
Selmer, Tennessee. I've forgotten her last name now.
It's O'Neill.
O'Neill.
Lucy O'Neill.
That's right. Okay. Well, then tell us how you happened to come to New Orleans.
And to pick up on my wife.
Yes.
She had been a missionary to China for about 9 years, and she was there during the Japanese occupation and was exposed to some of the dangers as the Japanese were moving into the Shanghai area. But she got away from China before the time of the Grips home and so forth, before that crisis period, that last point of that relationship. And so then I met her when she came into the Texarkana area to speaking in these churches. And of course we had this similar interest as far as China was concerned. And one thing led to another, and we soon thereafter were engaged and married. And then with that interest in China and hopefully going out to China in the future, then I got a letter from Jim Gregory. This must have been in 1952, the early part of the year. And he was asking whether I might be interested to become the first minister of the Chinese mission, which they hoped would develop into the Chinese Presbyterian Church. And it did that as of about 1957. So I was here about 5 years prior to our becoming an actual church with properly constituted under the work of the Presbytery.
Could you tell us a little bit about how the mission operated, what sort of things they did? And well, you were here. Wait a minute. Let me back up. When you came, had we started this new building?
Oh no, they had their plans for the educational unit at that time, and I made a couple of suggestions. And so 2 weeks after I got here in September of 1952, on September the 14th, I think it was, we broke ground out here on Bienville, and you remember that, I expect.
I remember it was a rainy day.
That's right, yeah, and we had a little pamphlet that Atlanta put out entitled Singing in the Rain. Yeah, and it was at the time when Miss Lois Garrison had been working with our Chinese mission for 25 years approximately. Part of that time maybe as a volunteer worker, but soon thereafter in 1928 she became the worker as director of the mission. And she was the type of person, even though she couldn't speak the language any more than I can speak it, yet she loved her way into the hearts and lives of the Chinese people. She ministered to them and for them. And there's one thing about Miss Lois that I would say, she never had anything critical to say about her Chinese people, her Chinese friends. And she was one who was a loyal servant of the Master, and no wonder she laid such a good foundation for the work that I would do. And so when I came here, we had an immediate entree into every home, and fortunately my ministry overlapped hers a year and a half. And so she was able to take me around and introduce me to all the people. And it was a very interesting experience to see how they did love her and how highly they regarded her.
Dayton, how many Chinese people were in New Orleans at that time? You have an idea?
I estimate that there must have been about 350 at that time. And of course we had the only Christian work among them.
So all of them were potentially
right, and
prospects.
And if there was a funeral, they'd call on me for the funeral because they felt like that we were the spiritual liaison between earth and heaven. And it was a wonderful opportunity to be a minister to not just the church group, those that were already Christians, but also to minister to the entire Chinese community. And we had the cemetery out at the end of Canal Street, and they had the cemetery within the cemetery that is a vaulted tomb area which would take care of about 40 bodies, I suppose. There's a little grate at the end of it, which may have been for those who were interested in burning a little incense at the end of the service, which was entirely separate from anything that I would have. And then once in a while, not only incense, but maybe burning a little paper money. They also would give out nickels wrapped in paper. I don't know whether that would go back to the custom in China of burning paper money at the time of funerals. Then too, they would give out a very sweet candy to all the people that were there. And I asked one lady, what does this mean, and what is the significance of this? And so this lady replied, after the bitter, the sweet. And so we were able to minister to the people and do a community work. And like if it was a matter of softball team for the Presbyterian Church, well, we included all the Chinese young men of the city, and they had a very good team when I came here, or soon after my coming here. And so they played in the Presbyterian Church League, and all the churches seemed to enjoy playing the Chinese, and they were well accepted. And that's one thing I would say, that discrimination in New Orleans, in our very cosmopolitan city, was a very rare thing. In fact, I don't think it existed. And if there was any conflict at any time, I think it would have been more of a personality conflict than a matter of a racial discriminatory aspect of things.
What? Well, you had the Chinese mission. This sort of is where I came into the picture too. I was on the committee, but y'all, after you tore down the old house on Roman Street, or sold it, and it got torn down eventually. Then before you had this building built, you worshipped in the old Britannia Street Presbyterian Church, where I was the pastor. For about how long? About a year?
That was a year, as well as I understand. And so as far as my part worshiping in your church and using your chapel on the ground floor, it was, I came in September, and I think we had our first service in the Chinese mission on Bienville with a new educational unit, which was an adequate type of facility at the time, and was the first real church type of facility to accommodate our educational work. And so it was really a wonderful step forward for us when we got into that building, I think around the last of March 1953. We might pick up there, Walter, on this thing of when I was called to this work. Jim Gregory was chairman of the subcommittee of Presbytery, and that was under the Home Missions Committee, I think, of Presbytery. And this subcommittee was a very active group of ministers and lay people. And so it was a happy relationship I had with them. But first, Jim Gregory, one Saturday night in the wee hours of the night, I think he finished a letter to me, a very lengthy letter, in explanation of the opportunity here and of the need, and of an overture in my direction as to whether I would be interested in maybe becoming minister here. And so I felt like that sort of fulfilled a dream that I'd had from way back yonder. In fact, in high school, I read a book on the Empress Dowager, which was the old China around 1900 and prior to that. And so I was fascinated, I guess, by something of a mystique to China. And then, you know, you have the Forbidden City, which you have at Peking. And it's such a rich thing with all these names that you transliterate into English. And it really is something, I think, that may be one of the reasons why we're drawn to Chinese people as we are, and myself individually. So I came to visit this work in the spring as a result of this letter from Jim Gregory. Also on that subcommittee was Harold Bridgman, who was a missionary, a lifetime missionary, you might say, to China with his wife, Eleanor, and she was a nurse. And so my wife had known the Bridgmans real well, and so that didn't hurt matters as far as my personal interest and her interest in moving to New Orleans to assume work as the first minister of the Chinese mission and of the Chinese people. But we as a presbytery had assumed that we would assimilate the Chinese into our Caucasian churches. Well, that just didn't happen. And the Chinese are strong people racially, and they have a very deep culture and a cultural identification there. And so it's very important that we minister to people in a way that makes them feel at home racially and culturally. And so we do need a racial church as we developed it here in the Chinese mission. And so as we came here, we did find that it was a wonderful opportunity that we had. Now our community would be probably from 1,500 to 2,000 people, and
these are, excuse me, let me interrupt you. In our talking before we started, you were saying that this posed something of a problem. These are not all as homogeneous a group as the Chinese were when you came here.
That's right, because we've had great immigration from those that came as students and then later became professional and business people from Taiwan. And so they, in many cases, were mainlanders. A few of them were Taiwanese whose families came from the mainland maybe 300 years ago to Taiwan. And so we have these two groups that have come into the community in much larger numbers. And it also, in our memory, would be indicative of maybe strong strains of peoples who are a little different, like you had your warlords on the China mainland during the Generalissimo's efforts to unify the country back in the 30s. We find that the warlords who gave allegiance to him, they were very individualistic and they wanted to do their own thing. And so you do have then these with very strong ideas and with a very strong identity, and they do not work in the same way as you would an American group as we have experienced.
And then of course you have a language problem in that your original group, that is the group that was here when you came, were all Cantonese.
From South China,
China, and spoke that language.
We're close to the coast, and we're the ones that immigrated to other countries and Southeast Asia.
Then the later ones, some of them, you have some Mandarin speaking Chinese, which is a different language.
And they came. The one speaks the Cantonese dialect, which has 8 or 9 tones. The Mandarin is a simplified tonal dialect of about 4 and 5 tones, and the pure type would be considered from around Peking. And so that group came over from the mainland, say in 1948 and 49 to Taiwan, and then they then later with their children especially coming over here for educational reasons. And now we do have in our work a Mandarin group that meets every other Friday night. There's maybe 25 of them will meet with Miss Yao. Then we have a Sunday school class that meets every Sunday now, and that's attended by 15 and 20 Mandarin-speaking people. I say is the most effective class that we have going right at the present. And so you see a need to minister to ones with maybe a little different background than the others.
This is just a difference between then and now. To go back to when you came, as I remember the thing when Miss Garrison was active in it, there was a very active language class. That lasted for a while after you came.
But that was in English.
That was, yes, to teach English to newcomers.
In fact, that I actually continued. I say, I'll have to look it up, but I think for as many as 10 years. And we also taught citizenship, and it really was a wonderful avenue of service to the Chinese. And we tried to have one-on-one as much as possible for teaching, so we could take the greatest advantage of the amount of time available to us once a week on Tuesday nights, I recall. And so we would teach citizenship, prepare them for citizenship. We have a paper that has a lot of questions and answers written in English and in Chinese. And so that also points up the fact that we do need to do work not only in English but also in Chinese, and our services are still bilingual with Cantonese and English.
You don't have to teach English anymore, do you?
No, in fact, a lot of these children taught their mothers. They were the ones that were the wives. The men had already been over here, and the wives then, as they would arrive, and after World War II, they really needed assistance in English. But in time, as the children would go to school, and they would bring home these books, the mothers would start reading along with the children, and the children almost taught the mothers in many cases to become very good in English. And so the need seemed to dwindle, and then we became in 1957 a church, and more we became organized as a church and with a church type of program. And it seemed like that as one was phasing out, the other one was phasing in, and so it was a matter of time and priorities, and we had to give more and more to the work as a church. And maybe if we did have enough time, why we could give some thought to further instruction in English.
There was some years back, I don't know whether you still do this or how long it lasted, there was a Chinese school for the children to teach children Chinese.
That's right.
You still do that?
No, in fact, there again, you had a dialect problem. And so our school was in Cantonese, but a lot of the people came from an area that you might speak of as a village, and that was a village dialect of Toisan. And so it wasn't really their native dialect exactly, though they were from the Guangdong province, or province of Canton, and they did understand Cantonese but didn't speak it. And so when these children would go home, they didn't speak the same dialect as the parents were speaking. I think maybe it would have been a better thing if we'd had a teacher that could have done it in Toisan, to just picked up any dialect that would have been one that would have been successful as teaching them a second language of Chinese, which had to be some dialect. And so I think maybe that was another reason why we didn't have quite as strong a support from parents as we could have. But in the last few years, with this stronger Mandarin group moving into the city, they do have on their own an independent studying every Saturday in the Methodist Church, and this has been going on for about 2 or 3 years now, and it's been very successful. And I don't know whether you know where Ding's restaurant is, just off of Veterans Highway, and they or Mrs. Ding Wu has done a very good job in her name actually is Go, K-U-O. But Ms. Go is very, very good, and with the people she's gotten to associate with her, they have a very successful Mandarin school, and not large in number, but still it maintains that Chinese language and culture, which I think is very good and important.
Also, one of the things that started out with the vision years and years ago was a hospital. When the new building was built, there was no provision for it. I guess it never was made.
There were plans on the original print to have a hospital right at the back of this educational unit down the hall. You just continued on into a hospital area, which anticipated maybe sort of a living room sort of thing, and a little kitchen, and then a breakfast room area, plus about 3 rooms upstairs, if I remember it correctly. But what happened, Walter, the need for that type of thing just didn't seem to exist too much. And so it would have looked like to me that we could have paid to put people up in case there was a need. as they came to the city, much more cheaply than to have the hospital. And usually with a hospital you need someone living in the area, and it might have been a very nice ministry, but it might have been one of those things that would have been in an area that would have expanded the work in a way that financially we wouldn't be able to do too well.
Well, I just remembered that was one of the things that dropped out of the picture.
Yeah, and it was, I think, a very important ministry. And like when Mr. Hoy came over here, what year was it? Maybe along about 1911 or 12. Well, he lived in the hostelry, and there were a few other young men that lived in the hospital, and Miss Creevy was the mother to these fellas, you might say, and she would darn their socks, and she was quite an interesting individual, which you'll hear more about. And so there was a great need at that time for a hostel, and these people learned English in that manner, being associated with a worker like that, and the worker, Miss Creevy, was just a mother to them.
That reminds me of another thing I was going to ask you. Why did these people come? I mean,
into the United States.
Into the United States.
Well, I think it was strictly desire for the economic advantages that would be.
Did they have any particular jobs in mind when they came?
When those who came here settled down, maybe way back before our work began in 1882, they about 10 years or 12 years prior to that, I know there were some Chinese that came over here and settled on a plantation, maybe 100 of them, but that didn't work out too well or too happily for them. But as they came into New Orleans, then I'm not sure exactly how the laundry work developed. It'd be a good thing to check into. But then in time they developed laundries in this area, and then groceries didn't seem to be a thing that took in New Orleans, and would be a later development for Chinese, I would say. Then as time went on, since I came here, we had 3 Chinese restaurants maybe when I came, and now then there are about 60 or more. They're just mushrooming. And so it shows that they got out of the laundry business, and then they gradually, and with the new ones coming in, went into restaurant work. It's a lot more lucrative, and we do have a few of these laundries that then went into cleaning establishments, very few of them, and they seem to be very successful. But there's a labor problem there to have laundries, and it's the cleaning end of the work that is more profitable, and so you have to go into a cleaning establishment if you're going to have anything like that.
And these were the men who came over for this, and then they sent for their wives.
Yeah, and they were all expected to go back to China after they made their money here, and so they always would think of their homeland. In fact, when these men would die during World War II, undertaker here indicated that they had right after the war, they took their bones for those that died during World War II and put them in tar containers, and then they shipped them back to be buried in their homeland, because that is very strong in the tradition of the Chinese, that they be buried back in their mother soil.
All right, let me lead it off with another question. That idea, I guess, is not so. Do they still do that? Do they still want to go back and be buried? I mean, do they want to be buried in China?
Well, I haven't even heard it discussed, because it was an impossibility because of the closed door to China with the communist position as it has been, hard and fast. And so I would think, though, that all the older ones would probably want to. However, it is a new day, and I wouldn't be able to anticipate what they do because too many of them have permanent type of tombs, like in Mandarin Cemetery and other places. So they won't be taken back to the mainland.
And you have a new generation too. Of course, the
Right,
ones who were born here.
I think it's entirely a new chapter.
Well, that's interesting. But tell me now about the church when it was organized. When was that?
1957.
1957.
About February the 13th, maybe. Almost the anniversary date of February the 12th.
I was on the committee at that time that was supervising the work, looking at it, not supervising really. But anyhow, as I remember, we had a little difficulty getting. We wanted 4 elders and 4 deacons. Was that it?
I think we ended up with 6 deacons and
6 deacons,
4 elders.
And 4 elders. How about that? That's pretty good.
Yeah.
And of course, this was all. These, of course, are all Chinese who have come up in the mission and became members of the church when it was organized. Maybe I ought to point out that a lot of these people were already members of the Presbyterian Church, but we followed that old subterfuge of enrolling them in other churches in the city. We had, I think, 70 members on the roll of the Britannia Street.
In fact, when I came here, we were meeting in your chapel. It was certainly a matter of convenience as well as your personal interest that we have our people, as they became Christians or transferred their membership to New Orleans. There weren't too many of those, but that they would unite with your church, which was the Britannia Street Presbyterian Church, and then later was merged into the Church of the Covenant. And I think when we were organized in the church, it was then the Church of the Covenant where the membership was held. Is that right?
It would be the Church of the Covenant was organized in '56, so that would be correct. So you had a lot of people who were already members of the church.
And you were their first pastor of the Church of the Covenant.
Right.
As it was merged with the Napoleon Avenue and the Britannia Street churches.
Yeah, well, there's another story there that's not part of this tale. Ashton Phelps suggested that we ought to call it the Church of the Miraculous Agreement. And the Church of the Covenant was as close as we could come.
Well, that was good. You made a good compromise suggestion.
Anyhow, how many members did you have when you started out? You remember that?
Walter, I think I have to look it up. It was about 90, in that area.
That's all right. I was
so
looking for an
the
idea.
Bulk of them came from the Church of the Covenant. And the others...
They came from the Chinese mission through the Church of the Covenant.
And the other large segment would have been from the Canal Street Church because of their historical connection with the mission.
We'll be getting into that later, or I will, in another connection. But of course, that is a part of the story, that the Canal Street Church was really where the Chinese mission began, and they have had a very close and working relationship with the mission and with the church. But that's another part of the story. You started out with about 90 members. You've got, how many you got now?
It would be close to 195 or 200.
Well over double.
Right.
Not many of us have doubled our membership over simple pastorate.
Yeah, well, the unique situation here is a reason for that.
And I meant to ask you a while ago. There's another group of Orientals who have come into the community, but they don't seem they seem all to be Roman Catholics. The Vietnamese. The Romans, I think, have been the most active in bringing them in, haven't they?
That's true, or they have been more active in working with them after they've gotten here. And so they have done something to try to help them with housing, maybe job situations, though I think a lot of the other people have also helped in various ways. But there's a strong Baptist work in New Orleans East, I think, working with the Vietnamese. And a lot of them are Buddhist, and they're not very sympathetic in some cases to Christianity. So I don't think you can generalize too much on how strongly Christian these people are. However, I understand and have met maybe a couple of men that they say are priests, but I don't know that they would have been trained in the way that your American priest has been trained.
Well,
they might be more like brothers of a certain description, and maybe not with such a strong educational background.
However, this group has not really affected your situation at all. There's no contact really between them.
I did try when this thing came up for having Vietnamese come to various communities in the United States. I took a trip over to Florida and Eglin Air Force Base, where all these Chinese were. And it so happened that Troy Adams of the Immigration Office here, director, was stationed over there for about 6 months or longer to help handle and process these Vietnamese. And so I went over there, and we got 3 young men to come over, and we got them a job in one of our Chinese restaurants. But they were not too much interested in Christianity, and a lot of these Vietnamese were interested in partying. I think they learned from the American GIs over in Vietnam. And then they were strictly interested in the dollar, and I guess in Vietnam they had been spoiled with the American dollar too. And so I noticed that these Vietnamese didn't mix and mingle too well. We have a Vietnamese who lived in Cambodia for a good while and worked with our U.S. military in Cambodia, and he and his family are pretty regular in attendance. But for Vietnamese, in another case or two, it's been very hard to get them where they felt at home in our situation, and I finally gave up as being there was a possibility or really a liable option for getting them to feel at home in our church and work, and that maybe this ministry should be for others in other ways to develop it. In fact, recently Miss Yao visited a Vietnamese young man who had with him about 20 that had just arrived to the city, but his interest seemed to be the matter of economic opportunity that might present itself, that he was fishing around for more than being receptive to spiritual interest. And she didn't feel like that it would warrant her time in working with them, that she could spend her time more profitably, say, like with the Mandarin group, where the work is developing so well right now.
Yes.
There is also a Taiwanese group. I don't know that we mentioned that, but they, whose families came to Taiwan 300 years ago from the mainland, they are also a group that we need to think in terms of, and that we have good contact with. And so the written language being the same, but it's more of the old Amoy dialect. And so we, during our evangelistic services recently with Dr. Chen, David Chen, who is pastor of the Reformed Church, First Reformed Church, a Caucasian church in Ridgewood, New Jersey, about 20 miles from New York City. He met with them as being a person who is Taiwanese, and so that does give us a real area where we might develop a good, strong work.
Let me go back again. Well, just for the record, Lucy died
in the December the 27th, 1953. So she was here about a year and 4 months while, but her effort was quite limited. And of course she was from North Jiangsu province, and she spoke a very good Mandarin, read the language, wrote to the Chinese friends, and so she did a good job in learning the Chinese, but her area of influence in the work was cut rather short.
Yes. Well, it was a tragic.
But we did at that time, I know, make a trip over to Biloxi, where the Formosa group was at Keesler Air Force Base. They were studying in the area of radar primarily, and so one time I know there were 100 people over there from Taiwan, and we'd have a dinner here, and she would be present and would talk Chinese, and it was a very good ministry. And we then found that group began to dwindle as they got people that were trained in the area of radar sufficiently, and then it dropped down to maybe 10 in the Formosa group over there, then maybe even less. But it was a very good contact. We made several trips over there to talk to them, and so it was a good ministry as long as it lasted.
You had a ministry with seamen too from time to time.
Oh yeah, that was work that I got introduced to, I guess, through a Baptist seminary student. He had been in Korea, was with strong Oriental interests, and he was wanting to know about this Chinese ship and wanted to visit it. So we went to the Haijiao, C-H-I-A-O, I believe, and so we had a very good contact there, and so that led I think that would have been around the end of 1953, and I know Lucy was able to meet some of the seamen I brought to the house, and so that ministry has developed, and especially with Mr. Charles C. John, who's retired now over Biloxi.
Is he over in Biloxi?
That's right.
I wondered what happened to him. He retired and went over.
And he'd be in the area of about 75 or maybe 79 years of age now. Yeah. He was a remarkable man. He'd been in the import-export business with a British steam lines, about the steamship company, and he was manager of their Shanghai office, and they say he had the first Cadillac in Shanghai, and so he knew a lot of the captains of these ships. And coming over here from Taiwan, where he had a lot of lay ministry, he was a natural for us, and he was recommended by Dr. and Ms. James and Montgomery, who were old China hands with our mission and China, and then Taiwan, and the China Sunday School Association, which is headquartered in Taipei now. And so they suggested Mr. John, and so he was a very fine worker for us for about 10 years, and then retired about 1966 or 65 when he reached the age of 65. And so Mr. John did this work with people that he might have known through his company, and knew several of these captains of these ships, so he had a good entree on board, and had this very fine ministry with these seamen. And we would work with the idea maybe we ought to establish a church on board every ship and try to organize prayer and Bible study fellowships with the Christians on board. And that's one of the neediest mission fields of all the world. It's brought to our very door. We send missionaries to these other lands, but here we're not doing enough in this area, but I think we've got a worker right now that can develop it. It doesn't justify a full-time worker, but Mr. John was unique from this standpoint. We'll go into that, I'm sure, on another occasion. But here you'll have 2, 3, and 4 Christians on board of a ship, 30 to 40 men. So you got one of the neediest mission fields in all the world brought to our very door. And so it's a shame that we aren't doing more as a Christian church in the city of New Orleans to minister to these people and to do work in the language of the people, because I'd say that that enhances the value of the Christian witness 90%, to be able to carry on the work in the native tongue of those that visit our port.
Didn't he do something with students too?
Oh yes, he developed that work, would visit these schools in Texas wherever there's a strong concentration of Chinese students. That meant from Hong Kong or from Taiwan. And so he'd go on up into Oklahoma, Fayetteville, Arkansas, and he would go into Memphis, and then University of Alabama, Auburn, Atlanta area, and Gainesville and Tallahassee, spread out in that direction, as well as Ole Miss and Mississippi State, where there's a goodly number, and Nashville. They usually have a fair number of Chinese. And at that time, it was a ministry that was especially needed, and he would go around and visit, and he'd ride on a bus, taking a very smallest amount of expense necessary. Then he'd stay in whatever place that he could at the cheapest way possible. But he made that dollar stretch a long ways and did a very effective work with Chinese students. And so I would always say that this was would be world missions in home missions. And so it was a very, very good way for outreach for the church. And on these ships, in a matter of days, your message would be to the farthest corners of the earth. Some ships would go to Europe with special cargo, would be chartered, maybe for sailing into South America ports, and then to the Far East, of course.
Well, I wanted to ask one other question about that. The Chinese ships, of course, that came during that period were all from Taiwan,
right? However, more and more there were some from Hong Kong.
From Hong Kong.
Yeah, there were some Chinese shipping owners from both areas, I guess.
Well, the Hong Kong would technically be British registered, wouldn't it?
I suppose so. And then
that's neither here nor there, but they're still Chinese.
Yeah.
Well, the other question I wanted to ask you was really about Miss Grace. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
I was on the committee when we were looking for her.
Yeah, that's right.
We had quite
In
a
fact,
time.
I went to a conference on Chinese churches out of San Francisco, I think in the fall of 1954. It was sponsored, I believe, or it was originated by the old, not council of churches, was it National Council? It was a federation. Federal Council of Churches. And so they had this conference in San Francisco, and I went out there. The committee sent me out there. I think maybe we can get a Chinese worker to take the place of Miss Garrison, who had passed away. And it looked like we needed more of a Chinese approach to the work, not such an English approach. And so we needed to get a successor to Miss Lois who would be Chinese. And so out there in those days, there just weren't workers over here. And the Chinese Americans hadn't developed along this line. And really what we needed was not necessarily Chinese America to do this. We needed somebody that understood the Chinese ladies, that come in after World War II. And we'd call these women that came to the United States and to New Orleans the war brides. and though I think that act of Congress or whatever it was to let war brides in, that was thinking in terms of Japanese, maybe German war brides, or those from Britain, Paris, and so forth, thinking in terms of that type of situation. But evidently it worked for Chinese servicemen, and so they'd go back to the mainland of China and bring their wives in. At least we call them war brides. And so then we needed someone to visit in the home. And since this didn't work out for us to get a worker from this country, then I heard from a fellow that was pastor at that time in Houston at a Baptist Chinese church, Hong Sit. He suggested a person that might be good. His father-in-law, Leland Wong, a very fine Chinese evangelist, was very well known, that he had mentioned Miss Yao, who later came here, as a possibility for their work. And so he thought maybe it would be better to get one with more of a Baptist background than Miss Yao, because her mother and father were elders of the Chinese church, Presbyterian Church in Swatow, China, which is a part of the Guangdong province. And so we started corresponding with her. She was working in Hong Kong. And so gradually and with great effort, we were able to get her, I believe it was 1958. So she's been here now 21 years. And she, I say, took the church to the home until the home comes to the church. And she's been very good in being able to adapt to, say, American type of church situation, which we find here, and not so much like the Hong Kong situation, which is quite different in many ways. And so we've been very fortunate in having her.
Now, in your service, she takes care of the Chinese language
Well,
part.
she will read the scripture,
She reads the scripture
in Cantonese, and have a prayer in Cantonese, and give a resume of my sermon in Cantonese. So when the people tell me that Miss Yao spoke too long, I know they mean that I preached too long.
Well,
but they're too, like the Mandarin says, tai chi, overly gracious, to say directly, except some of my Chinese American friends that I preached too long.
I was here the other night when she translated the Dr.
Chan
his sermon, and because I don't understand the Chinese, but I have an idea she did it better than he did. Anyhow, she seemed to do it very well, and everybody was very attentive.
Well, a lot of the Caucasians that visit enjoy watching the interpreter.
Mm-hmm. Anyhow, that's the program of the church, as you indicated earlier. We're going to run out of time here in a minute. The program of the church, you indicated earlier, is pretty much churchy now. Just
yeah.
The normal.
Well,
thing.
one thing just to follow up on Miss Yao. She helped us when we organized the women of the church into a women of the church organization. It wasn't just a women's club. And she also then helped us in organizing 3 circles. And to show the matter of the importance of Chinese, the older women's circle is in Cantonese, and the younger women's, now they're not so young, is also Cantonese, and there's an English-speaking circle. And so right now, though, we've gone into 2 English-speaking circles. And so that all tells us something, you know, about maybe how the situation changes a little, and also the importance of 2 languages, though maybe now we need Taiwanese circle. I haven't verbalized this before now, as well as a Mandarin circle.
Well, maybe you can spread out some more, just so you don't spread too thin.
Yeah, well, that's where we may need to get another worker, in time. But that brings on added problems.
Well, I think maybe we've gone long enough to wear you out, and we can always come back and get some more information later if we need. I want to express my appreciation to you, Dayton, for your fine cooperation and all that you have done here and said. I think this has been a marvelous ministry,
And may I interrupt and say that I think we're most fortunate to have someone who has made church history his avocation throughout the years, and to have you with your personal interest and your knowledge and experience of the Chinese mission and church, and to have you work on our church history. So we're most fortunate, Walter, and I want you to know that I personally appreciate it too.
well, it's been I haven't really started yet, but it's a pleasant task, and I think it's going to be a delight to do. And I do appreciate your kindness in doing this, and we'll have more later, I'm sure.
It's my pleasure. I can talk all day on the Chinese church.
Well, we probably will before we get through.
Okay.